Whenever you hear people praise Hollow Knight, it's usually because of the usual suspects: exploration, lore, general vibes. But the combat feels rather overlooked, seen as nothing more than a simple, serviceable vehicle meant to deliver you to the actually meaningful content. I come with a polar opposite perspective. I didn't care much for the usual suspects. In fact, I felt that elements like the exploration were dull for a majority of the game, but I was very interested in the fighting. In fact, I was so intrigued by it that I pushed past the boring early sections and actually ended up beating the entire game. Charmless, I might add. All for the combat. I genuinely believe there is more there than people realize. A short attack range that keeps you close to enemies, a focus on contact damage that keeps that close range threatening, and repositioning to avoid attacks. All the ingredients for great 2D combat are there, and for a while they valorized. Maybe not to the extent they could, but it's a great combat template nonetheless. Until you get the Shadow Cloak, a pickup that gives your dash invulnerability on a short cooldown. From that point on, things went sour quick, and not only do I want to explain why, I'd like to make a case against iframes in general. Earlier, I mentioned repositioning to avoid threats. I believe that this is the core of HK's fighting. Let's take for example, ground-based attacks. Enemies in Hollow Knight will often cover the ground with big dash attacks. You're expected to either jump over them or stay out of their range. You have no other means to avoid it. No blocking, no nothing. It's either don't get touched or take damage. In the act of jumping over these attacks, you have timing. Just messing that up can have you take a hit. You have the execution of it. If you mess up your jump's trajectory or let go of the jump too early, you could be punished. You also have just plainly reading the attack. Sometimes the enemy will be too wide or too tall for a simple jump, which means you have to improvise. That complexity in decision making applies to staying out of the range too. Not only do you need to get a feel for how far the attack reaches, you also need to react in time. And, on top of all that, get to the spot where you actually need to stand. Same thing applies to air-based attacks. In fact, one of the earliest bosses in the game, the Gruzmother, has you walk under its room-wide smashes in a very small space. In fact, because pure mobility is so key to avoiding damage, staying in the air becomes a very attractive choice. Gives you a wider range of motions compared to walking on the ground. That is good, because the air has gravity, and managing that gravity in relation to threats is a very deep layer, perfectly applying to the existing dynamic. Hopefully, I've illustrated a bit that moving out of the way is an entire deep gameplay system by itself. In fact, I'll claim that it has almost endless novelty built in. The exact same jump with the same trajectory but from two different spots will have the player respond in a totally different way. Now multiply that by hundreds for every single point in a 2D screen. You can technically see every single possibility, but by the time you do, you've already forgotten enough for the sense of novelty to come back. Finite on paper, infinite in practice. As the game goes on, you naturally get more abilities that influence your positioning. A dash to cover a short distance, or a ground smash to quickly descend. The smash has residual iframes, and you get some after you get hit, but largely the game is steadfast in this vision of dodging damage by moving. Until the player gets the Shadow Cloak. The core difference that separates the cloak from the other two sources of frames is that it's context-insensitive. In the case of the pound, you need to commit to doing the move, which is vulnerable. For the take damage frames, you need to, well, take damage. But the cloak is there at any point if it's off cooldown. It is iframes from neutral, meaning that the player can access them regardless of the situation they're in. Now instead of having to think about momentum, size, direction, or anything fuzzy and engaging like that, you simply need to worry about your timing. A very forgiving one at that. This is very easily seen with early game bosses that become complete pushovers. But it does not stop there. The further you get into the game and the better the bosses become, the more insidious the iframes seem. Take Grim and his downward attack for example. Without iframes, you need to jump over the slam, but without touching the flame that he leaves behind. You're expected to control your jump. Alternatively, you could walk towards and under his slam to redirect it and make it miss entirely. Both distinct movements you use in different contexts. But when the cloak is present, you simply dash through the slam. That's it. No control of gravity and momentum, no pixel perfect movement, just vaguely correct timing in a binary direction. There are many other examples just like this. What we can conclude then is that the iframe dash is an assistance that flattens depth. Complex 2D movement and gravity is smashed into a simple rhythm game-like button. Seeing as a massive part of combat in Hollow Knight is dealing damage while not taking it, it's fair to say that this murder of depth is quite problematic. What makes all this worse is that the iframes were in no way necessary. There are very few attacks in Hollow Knight that are unavoidable, and the ones that exist we'll discuss later. So not only can most damage be consistently evaded with movement, the entire 2D plane has no use for these frames as an assistance at all. The only reason why iframes became such a popular design element in the last 25 years is because 3D melee games were too afraid to have the player actually parse space enough to move in complex ways. Whether 3D games need iframes or not is irrelevant to this video, but the point is that 2D provides you with a full, precise view of hitboxes. The situation will sometimes get where you are clipped by something you cannot see, just cannot happen in 2D. So it's assistance to alleviate a problem that does not exist. All the depth flattening, none of the positive. While it's good that the cooldown exists, it about matches up the interval in which majority of bosses attack in. So what happens is, you have on-demand invulnerability for majority of boss attacks in the fight, despite it being limited on paper. Even if we assume that the cooldown did make a big difference, the iframes still exist, and a massive percent of the fight will be spent in a state with low game depth. One of the first defenses they'll fly out is that despite the Shadow Cloak reducing the depth, it still has some, and therefore cannot be called bad. Well, that's absolutely true, but it doesn't really mean anything. Every mechanic and element in a game has depth, so the real question is how much, how does it compare to alternatives, and does it fit the vision? Yes, Shadow Cloak has depth in regards to timing. However, if you recall earlier, movement already has a big focus on timing. In fact, it's based around a harder to parse, fuzzier, and therefore more engaging rhythm. It's also worth noting that the length of your dash matters too, but again, movement already has a way deeper sense of positioning, so the Shadow Cloak does not introduce anything new that is just as good. It simply replaces complex, layered dynamics with simpler ones across the board. You only need to make a simple value judgment to see it. There is, however, another strong argument to be made here. From what I've played and observed, the less you dash, the more DPS you can dish out. At first glance, that might seem like enough balance. However, upon closer inspection, it falls apart. Firstly, as established, the cloak is available from neutral, with no setup required. So it's not so much that the player is choosing an alternative branch to dealing damage, it's more like the player has the invulnerability in their back pocket, for whatever they need it. So even if you choose to prioritize aggression, you still reach for the cloak whenever you have to. Even if with practice you need it less and less, it's always there. Even if we imagine there was an actual real choice between safety and DPS, you'd always choose safety anyway. Hollow Knight has no time-sensitive pressure to actually incentivize DPS. There is no game over timer that punishes you if you stall or do low damage. The global speedrun timer exists, but because it has no actual consequence on the gameplay, it's an incredibly weak, almost non-existent reason. So not only is aggressive play simplified because of the presence of iframes, there isn't even any reason to actually play riskily. Everything in Hollow Knight's combo design rewards bidding for big openings, which to be fair still manages to be engaging because of the movement-based dodging. So when the Shadow Cloak swoops in and destroys most of the depth there anytime it's up, it becomes an actually large flaw in the combat. It's easy to throw out the baby with the bathwater and proclaim that the entire dash system itself is a problem just because the iframes are bad. But it's important to understand that yes, the morph wings reduce the depth of movement, but they reduce it minimally and in its place introduce another element. More importantly, they do not subvert the core of contact damage, so unlike the Shade Cloak, movement-based dodging is preserved, just in a different way. This is why I say that Hollow Knight's combat is hurt when you get the Shade Cloak, not when you get the Morphwing one way earlier. You might feel that this distinction is not worth making, but you'd be surprised how often players, without even thinking, believe that assistance elements like iframes are just a part of movement mechanics, like dashes or rolls. There seems to be a mental barrier that stops players from seeing the Dark Souls roll as purely a spacing tool, rather than something to phase through attacks with. As long as players are incapable of separating them, we'll never be able to look at them properly, or implement them in a good way. There is actually one final counter-argument that seriously needs to be addressed. An opponent might state that the existence of invulnerability allows Team Cherry to create new attacks that they cannot before, and therefore make up for the insane flattening of depth. As the last argument, on the surface this one seems beyond valid. It almost seems to render the rest of the video completely null. However, just like the other one, it falls apart on closer inspection. Bear with me for a moment. What is the only attack type that requires iframes to dodge? Woes. If you're not a shmup player, allow me to explain. Woes are hostile objects, patterns, enemies, etc. that are almost or fully impossible to avoid with positioning. You can look at them as inevitable damage, and therefore only dodgeable with some sort of invulnerability. A perfect example of a woe attack is the Radiance Beam. It sweeps across the scene, and sooner or later the player will come in contact with it. So the Shade Cloak allows Team Cherry to add wall attacks. Depth regained? No, not at all. If you take a look at how the player avoids woes, it's by dashing through them with the right timing. The exact same dynamic for every other attack in the game. So woes do not restore any depth at all, because there is nothing special about dodging woes from neutral. It is the same boring binary reaction time test that every other attack gets reduced to whenever the Shade Cloak is up. Does this mean that woes are a worthless type of hostile pattern? Not at all actually. The value of woes is that they take the player out of the comfort of movement and throw them into the dynamic of having to find invulnerability in order to avoid the damage. So imagine if the iframes were context sensitive in any way. If there was some type of setup or special condition needed to activate them. Now the woe shows up on screen and the player must engage with whatever system the designer locked iframes behind. In the context of Hollow Knight, finding iframes is as simple and as boring as pressing a button with the vaguely correct timing, which is in turn why the woes provide almost no interesting gameplay. The Shade Cloak not only flattens the game's depth, it fails to provide any meaningful, fun alternative. The subject of this video is Hollow Knight, but you could really take these points and apply them to majority of modern 2-dimensional games. It feels like every other week, a 2D game is either released or announced, showing promise of interesting movement and combat, just to reveal an invincibility defense button, significantly flattening its depth and demolishing its appeal. For the last 25 years, 3D has clearly dominated the charts, and it's clearly the majority of both what designers and players play. In the eyes of the player, 2D games are just cheaper, worse 3D. And is that really so shocking though? Young designers grow up and study 3-dimensional games. Then they take these conventions into 2D with zero critical thought. They neglect to study the lineage of what they make, so the 2-dimensional games end up less something good and different, more just flattened 3D. If you're still not 100% convinced of the value of positioning, just take a look at all the subgenres and type of games that use it as a core, from shmups to survival horror to beat-em-ups. Now take a look at on-demand invincibility. Nothing to show, nothing to prove that it has any value beyond just subverting positioning to make games worse. So abandon frames, there are better ways to help the player, and embrace positioning, because that is the core strength of the perspective.